Imagine a perfect world where all schools across the nation would have the same access to resources and school funding. Fortunately, this is currently inexistent, as many schools do not receive the same amount of resources and funding as other schools, resulting with inequities among individuals in society. These individuals are students whose education is being affected due to the critical issue of lack of resources and unequal distribution of resources and funding districts are receiving. According to the National Center for Education Statistics from Elementary and Secondary Education Finance in 2013-2014, Mississippi had total expenditures for education to be over $4 billion compared to the U.S. average spending, which is over $12 billion. Why is Mississippi $8 billion below the U.S. average? If we compare Mississippi to New York's spending, New York within the same time period spent on average over $60 billion. Different states spend different amounts of money based on the funding that they receive from different government authorities. Some states receive more money than other states, leading to inequity of funding to schools. Student populations that are mainly impacted by this issue are students who live in urban and migrant areas. Student populations of Latinos and Blacks typically live in these areas and are being segregated within these schools in these areas. Students in these areas are funded based on their property value, which is typically very low. Many teachers do not want to teach in these schools due to low pay and lack of resources provided. The amount of resources distributed to schools is based on where students live, as they are given their resources from the state. One part of the issue is the shared responsibility between the different government authorities. According to Rachel Ostrander, local communities and state and federal governments have no clear defined areas of influences with distribution of funding to schools, which leads to the lack of accountability that impacts schools. Another argument with this issue is the conflict in which various state governments define the term adequate education. State constitutions are also not stating ways in which how the education will be adequate. In other words, there are no specific guidelines in the ways in which the education and learning for students will be satisfactory. According to Jackie Young Lee, there is a link between how students perform on assessments and school funding. There are certain resources that are needed and required for students to understand concepts and have adequate learning in order to meet specific state standards. Michael Hoffman states that studies have been shown that schools with higher budgets and schools that have more money funded, those students in those schools have shown to achieve better test scores. This critical issue of lack of resources and funding in schools fosters inequities because not all schools are able to have access to all the tools needed for students to succeed, while some schools have the access and funding. According to Bruce Baker, lack of resources leads to an academic gap and a decrease in academic achievement due to lack of resources and school funding has affected many schools across the nation. One school affected specifically is shown here from Dodge City, Kansas.
We've reduced support staff. We've had to do away with a lot of our after-school support. Numbers of students in our classrooms and the number of students with the needs that our teachers need to be able to address. We're almost to that critical.
If schools do not have the sufficient resources and technology for students to develop their learning, how are schools going to expect students to meet the state standards and display their full understanding through mandated assessment? The driving force in my interest in this critical issue is making connections back to personal experiences I have had. My mom grew up in the state of Mississippi and was a teacher there for 3 years. Over the years, I have always been interested in comparing how classrooms function in different states other than the classrooms in New York. I was curious and investigated the statistics for funding that schools receive in Mississippi compared to New York, and the statistics were shocking as we have seen. Then it made me think about how other states were likely not receiving the same funding and having a lack of resources like Mississippi, and I was correct. I wanted to keep researching to see the causes and reasons for this inequity. One way I would attempt to address this issue to ensure equity for all students is to not only reward schools that have high achieving scores on assessments. All students have the same rights and deserve to have the same access to resources no matter where they live and how they score on assessments. Students may not be achieving the higher assessment scores due to lack of resources and funding in their schools. We need to look at the individual needs of each school and allocate money based on the resources that schools need for their students. This critical issue teaches me that more students across this nation do not have access to the same resources and adequate funding that they should have. Teachers take on a huge role by using the resources they receive in creativity and providing sufficient learning to students. This is not only affecting students' assessment scores, but their development and learning across different contexts. As my current role as an educator, I will continue to work with the resources I receive at the various schools I substitute teach at and in my future classroom to find ways through various methods to provide the best education to my students.